Everyone, welcome to another Random Talk Sunday. And today I thought it'd be interesting to talk about a show that I've discovered at least relatively recently. In other words, I knew about this show, but I never got a chance to really get around to watching it. Um, and I thought it would be cool to talk about it, considering the fact that I haven't really addressed that many television shows. Now, the reason why I don't really talk too much about television is only because a lot of television, at least a lot of the television nowadays, I find to be like very just not as well put together. And again, there's obviously exceptions to this, and I'm not saying that it's it's they're not there's not television shows that don't have certain aspects to them that are interesting or engaging, but it's just to say that there seems to be a significant majority where it's kind of just designed to be sort of, you know, uh, not as well informed or as interesting or engaging, and they don't seem to tie in things all too well with a lot of television shows, I've noticed. Um, Again, and I think there's some that try to do a genuinely good job, um, but then sometimes they'll get lost at times. And but this one in particular, I think, seems to hold itself up as being fairly well orchestrated. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, again, this particular television show that I'm talking about has books based upon it. But again, obviously, even though it doesn't, it has, there's other shows that don't really have material and that are able to work something from them. I think it does really help when you have something that is as significantly um, big as this particular sort of series of books. And obviously, the television show that I'm talking about, as you can probably tell by the title and thumbnail, is Game of Thrones. Now, regardless, I think whether or not you enjoy or don't enjoy this particular show, it still, I think, brings up a lot of interesting concepts and uh, talks about various family dilemmas that I think are very intriguing and interesting to watch. Um, I think what also really works well is the fact that pretty much, not the majority of the characters, but a good chunk of the characters have these these shades of gray within them. I like characters that have shades of gray. I've always been a fan of having these kinds of characters because I think they're a lot more in depth, they're a lot more interesting, and they provide a lot more context into their actions and whatnot. So again, this is what Game of Thrones provides. Um, and that's why I think a lot of the times when you think of a lot of these characters, they seem to have this sort of memorable aspect to them, or at least have memorable aspects to them. Um, Now, as far as what the show is about, it's sort of supposed to be referencing, as far as from what I can tell, um, real historical events that happened, I believe, after um, Elizabeth I was no longer alive. I think it's supposed to be after that period in time when there was a lot of distress and whatnot. Um, and I think it's supposed to be the War of the Roses, if I'm not mistaken, to what this particular fictionalized universe of Game of Thrones is supposed to be referencing to. And it could obviously be pointing to various other bits and pieces of time and various different events, but I think that's what it's primarily trying to uh, bring forth to the table. And in doing so, you get a very interesting look into these various different kingdoms. Um, yeah, and all of these kingdoms sort of have various different rivalries with one another. And a lot of it is about playing sort of the Game of Thrones, in other words, trying to get power. And I think that's just something that's very intriguing and really shows you the sort of kind of political aspects that end up occurring when you have a society that is sort of like the societies within the Game of Thrones, and you have these people just vouching each other for power, and having these betrayals and whatnot, and this excessive drama. It's kind of very Shakespearean, I'd say, in that sense. But it really does work, and it's quite engaging for the most part. Now, could you make a complaint about, is there too much violence in the show? Is there too much nudity? Is it bringing about things that are kind of somewhat controversial and, kind of not as rosy? Yeah, you can obviously say that there has been a lot of shows, and in particular this one, that kind of try to go over the edge. But I mean, obviously, since this show is based within HBO, I think it would only make sense that it would go a little bit over the top and be not as standard as a lot of other television shows are. But despite, again, its aspects to it that are a little bit over exaggerated, and having certain amounts of debauchery and whatnot, despite all of that, there is the underlying aspects to it that really what sells, I think, the show, and that's the fact that these relationships between all of these characters not only are complex, but they're interesting, and you sort of understand where at least some of the characters are coming from. And you sort of place your loyalty onto various kingdoms and whatnot, because there's some points where one kingdom you can sort of see is sort of in the wrong, but then the other kingdom that tries to sort of fight back, they end up creating sort of wrongs within themselves as well. So it plays along with all these different factors, and in doing so, it creates an overall very dynamic and interesting environment. And I think that's why I personally find it to be really enjoyable. It's, again, and it has really nothing to do with the fact that there is a certain amount of violence to it, or there is a certain amount of nudity and all that. It's more so the underlying points that the show tries to make, and hearing the characters talk with one another, and the way in which the dialogue is formulated and how the actors present the characters is just well done, and just great entertainment. It's what sort of, I think, a lot of entertainment should try to be. Again, obviously, I'm not the biggest fan of having the sort of excessiveness that sometimes it can have at certain points, but its underlying themes and its importance to what it's talking about as far as power and relationships, I think is very important, and really highlights things that, again, I think a lot of people, even within this day and age, can sort of identify with and kind of get behind. But that's just really my honest thoughts on the show. I mean, I really don't want to kind of really talk about, the really deep intricacies of what the show is about. Really, all you need to know going in is that it's supposed to be this sort of medieval looking world. Again, it's highly based within fantasy, and it is sort of trying to reference sort of these kinds of historical bits and pieces of the past, and I think a lot of it has to do with the War of the Roses, if I'm not mistaken. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say, though. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care.